Hi there, it's my pleasure to be with you here today and talk to you a bit about why I think good open science must be inclusive. So, first, a quick introduction. My name's Cassandra. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and my background is in neuroimaging. I completed my PhD in 2014, and since then, I've done a couple of postdocs at the University of Sussex and most recently at the University of Oxford. And in the last year, I have transitioned from being an average researcher to being the Open Science Community Engagement Coordinator at the Wellcome Centre for Integrative Neuroimaging, also known as the WIN at the University of Oxford. And this is a wonderful position that I'm very pleased to hold, where my basic role is to get people interested in open science and help them learn about and use open science infrastructure. And alongside my open science work, I'm also really passionate about inclusivity. So in the rest of this talk, I hope to talk to you a bit about what inclusivity is and why I think it's important for open science, and how I bring that to all of my work in organizing diverse events with and training in large and small groups. So hopefully by the end of the presentation, you'll be feeling a bit more comfortable with some ideas about inclusivity and how you can bring inclusivity to your work as well. So this is me, and this is me now with slightly more pink hair. So what inspired this talk the first time around was a comment from a colleague who said that they are pro open scholarship or open science, and they're pro inclusivity, but they weren't sure whether one necessarily implies the other. And I think that's true. They don't have to by default. Open science doesn't have to be inclusive, but I feel very strongly that it improves the robustness of our research. And alongside doing better science, it also makes for more equitable access to who can do research and who can replicate and extend results. So I think in all, it's a good thing, and it's something we should be considering when we're talking about open science. So in case anyone's not familiar what open science is, it's, I think, an umbrella term, as you'll hear that metaphor in many places. It's an umbrella term that involves various movements to remove the barriers from sharing scientific research at all stage and scientific resources. So it's about removing barriers. So what are the barriers to sharing scientific resources? So we could think in practical terms, things like software, hardware, who's got the time to do open science or share resources, who's incentivized, and who is appropriately trained to share resources. And these are all legitimate barriers to sharing. But I would like us to think about whether these are also the same barriers to reproducibility. And I think they are. So if you can't share resources, then other people can't reproduce your work. And the barriers that we've listed here, these practical barriers, they can be the result of a lack of resources, or they can also be the result of historical privilege or exclusion. So, for example, having access to paid for software depends on having money. And if you're from a group that's historically excluded, you may not have as much funds available to pay for things like licensed software, sorry. So I think to reproduce, extend, and verify research findings, we need to be able to access the resources. And the more people who have access to our resources, the more opportunities we have for robust replication and extension, which is ultimately what we're looking to do in open science. We want to make opportunities and make it possible for people to replicate and extend our work, to verify it and fit it to their own requirements. So now a quick dip into some terminology. You might hear people talking about diversity, inclusion, inclusivity, but they don't mean exactly the same thing. It's not too important to dwell on the specifics of why this is, but just bear in mind that they don't always mean the same thing. So in terms of like a metaphor about a party, diversity is being invited to the party. So you can invite a diverse audience to your events. Inclusion is about being asked to dance. So with your diverse audience, you have to actively work to enable them to participate. And inclusivity is making the environment possible for them to participate and for everyone to be on board and value it. So you've invited diverse people to your party, you've asked people to dance, but now you've actually got to make them feel welcome and want to dance, and everyone has to be on board with it as well in order to make an inclusive environment. Another quick terminology thing is the difference between equality, equity, and justice. So equality in this metaphor is, here we've got people who are trying to watch a football game and there's a fence in the way. So equality would be lifting up everyone to the same level or giving everyone the same additional platform. But as you can see, this has not benefited everyone equally because everyone wasn't impacted equally by the barrier of the fence. So a step up from equality is equity. That's giving extra support to people who need additional support to participate. So here, the shortest person in our metaphor has been given extra support in order to see over the fence. And this is the kind of thing you see with affirmative action and policies around that kind of practice. But then one stage further, which I think we should be looking for, is justice. So here, instead of giving people additional support, all we do is remove the barrier in the first place. So instead of having to prop people up differentially, if we remove the barrier that exists for everyone, some people can see over already by themselves, then we have no problem. We have no need to give additional support to some people specifically over others, because everyone can access the resources or watch the football game in exactly the same way. So this, I think, is what we should be looking to move towards in terms of science and open science. It's not just equitable access or equality of access, it's justice-oriented access. What barriers can we remove completely such that nobody has to have additional support to access our research? So now we're moving on to why inclusivity, I think, is specifically beneficial for the process of science. And for me, it comes down to creating a robust research output. So if you imagine a situation where you've only got a very small group of people contributing to a research agenda, then those people will address the agenda in the same way, using their same background and their same cognitive appraisal each time. If you have a diverse group of people who are addressing the research question, each group or each person will address it from a slightly different perspective. So you will have, as a result, the objective scientific output, but that objectivity will be gained from multiple viewpoints. So the final result that we can all agree on is in fact something which is much more objective because it's been viewed from different angles, rather than trying to perceive it from the same angle all the time. And in inclusive environments, not only do we have that diverse viewpoints, but we also are empowering everyone to share their experiences and viewpoints. And this comes in practice, not only when we're planning our projects, but also in the system of science. For example, who is empowered to publish their results in a specific journal? So one obvious limitation here is that English is the lingua franca of scientific research. So people who are able to write in English and also have their articles reviewed without being sent back saying the language isn't good enough, these people are prioritized in terms of the dissemination of their scientific research compared to people who aren't speaking English. So without inclusivity and empowering everyone to contribute, the differentials of who gets to contribute to our scientific knowledge and scientific basis are privileging some people over others. And that means that we're missing those viewpoints. Those viewpoints that aren't privileged aren't going to be brought into our scientific discussions. Another place where robust research is meant to be evidenced is some research which was done around decision making. So there's this is kind of quite regularly cited as one of the best sources of evidence that diverse teams produce better outcomes. But in the next few slides, I'll explain what this, how this study was conducted And I think it's perhaps slightly misleading, but I think it's onto the right idea. So diverse teams lead to better outcomes. In this research, we had groups of people making decisions on a decision-making platform, and there were simple measures of the biographic diversity of the people who contributed to the decision-making process. And the more diverse the group was, the better the decision that was made at the end of it. Now, what the authors of this work readily admit, and it's quite well recognized, is that more diverse teams do increase the friction. So it's much easier to work with everyone who's exactly the same as you, because you all have the same basis, you all have the same viewpoints, and you all have the same understanding. So when you mix the teams up and become more diverse, it becomes more complicated to communicate, for example. So increasing diversity does increase friction, but overall that friction is not significant compared to the amount of advantage that's gained by having the diverse inputs. Now, this research, as I said, is based on not scientific experiments. Not that the experiment wasn't scientific, but it's not based in a scientific environment. So this research was done with a decision-making platform, and it's sponsored by the company who runs the decision-making platform. And what they had was business teams making decisions about typical management and executive decisions, for example, hiring or staffing or project planning. And what they had is the decision maker entered a question and opened the forum up for decisions. And they measured 2 to 3 months after the decision was made. They asked the decision maker, was the outcome better than you expected? And if it was better than they expected, then it exceeded their expectations, and the decision was like formalized as better. They'd made a better decision if the outcome exceeded the expectations of the person who originally posted the question about hiring, staffing, project planning, for example. Now, as I said, this research is touted quite broadly, but this isn't the whole picture. As you can imagine, this is just like a very simplified version. So if we step into the literature, the occupational psychology and that kind of literature, there's much more nuanced interpretations that we should be aware of, and it can also be helpful in interpreting our own behaviors. So one of the key findings in the occupational psychology literature is this idea of fault lines. So here I've got a picture of a fault line where an earthquake might have taken place to help me remember what a fault line is. So you can have a diverse group, but if you can split those groups on some characteristics, then what you actually got is a number of small subgroups who are aligned on certain characteristics. So for example, if you have a group of people who are mixed on gender and age and seniority, but all of your most senior people in the group are men and all of the most junior people are women, then on the face of it, where it looks like you've got a diverse group, you've actually got two groups that are very similar or have demographic similarities. Now, what happens, or what the finding is, when you have these subgroups that are split by these demographics or characteristic fault lines, you actually end up building up stereotypes and biases within your group against each other. So instead of having one big diverse group, you've got two subgroups which are operating independently. But what you can do to overcome this, and these stereotypes lead to each group making interpretations about the other and protective behaviors, for example. If you mix up the groups, truly cross-characterize across those demographics, then these kind of stereotyping effects disappear. So instead of having all of your senior colleagues being male or all of your most junior colleagues being female, you need to work hard to mix them up. So you've got senior female employees and junior male employees. Another really interesting finding, I think, is around error culture. So if you keep these subgroups, then in this study, there was a manipulation of error culture. So where these subgroups existed, they gave some groups, they positioned a belief around error prevention, where you were told that if you made an error, this is something that's going to be really like bad for the group and for the experiment. So that's something that you should not only prevent, but it's probably going to be something that you're going to want to keep to yourself. Whereas in an error management culture, you're encouraged to talk about the error and think about ways to mitigate it very openly. If you are working in a situation where you have subgroups, then the error management and the error prevention culture have very strong effects. So in the error management culture, where you're encouraged to talk about things openly, then a subgroup can really help lead to inclusive communication and improved team learning. But if you're in an error prevention culture experimentally imposed upon you, then the inclusive communication is suppressed and team learning is suppressed. So understandably, if you don't talk about the problems that you've encountered, then the team isn't going to learn and benefit from them. Interestingly though, when you mix the groups, so you don't have these such widely split subgroups in your team, for example, then imposing an error culture has no effect on the team learning or inclusive communication. So by not creating these small clubs or these small cliques, the sort of grand ideas don't become so infixed or entrenched in the behavior of the team, which I think is really interesting. So it's kind of protective a bit from potentially damaging or limiting behaviors that we don't want to see in teams, and certainly we don't want to see in our scientific collaborators' activities. Another really interesting thing is that the pro-diversity beliefs of a leader can mitigate the effect of these homogeneous subgroups. So if you have these subgroups that are made up of similar characteristics, any kind of negative effects that you see in them can be overcome if the person who is leading the group actively demonstrates how important diversity and inclusivity is. So if you find yourself in one of these very mixed teams, look out for someone who's going to be on your side or on the side of pro-diversity, and encourage them to be actively supporting diversity in the work. And this can start off in a small research group setting, but it can also extend up to the whole culture of a department or an institution. So sticking with this thing about pro-diversity beliefs of leaders, just to clarify this picture. So when I was creating this slide, I had all these questions. Who has designated your research question as important as a leader? Who is the person who's designed your research? Who has contributed to your research? And is this person of a specific demographic or a specific diversity characteristic? And I was thinking, how can I illustrate who in a nonsensical way? And the images that I found was of Doctor Who. So Doctor Who's a TV program in the UK that's been running for many, many years, I think since like the 60s or something. And the main character, the Doctor, he's kind of this alien, and the Doctor reincarnates. They die and they get reincarnated with a different body and a different face, but it's always the same Doctor. Now, from say like 1960s, 70s when it started, the Doctor has always been a white man. And then in 2017, the first female Doctor, Jodie Whittaker, was introduced. And then in 2020, this year, the first Black Doctor, Jo Martin, was introduced. So this is just me thinking about who is the person, or who are the people that are designing our research questions? Do they all look like the Doctor pre-Jodie Whittaker, or at least pre-Jo Martin? And what impact does that have on the research that we're conducting? You know, how do the interests of the last two Doctors, the female Doctors, how do they differ from the first N Doctors? Does their demographics or their characteristics or their diversity experience impact what they think is an important research question? So I don't know the answer to this. We do know that there's been some research recently that suggested that the interests of Black Doctors or Black researchers are not getting funded so much as those the submissions that come from white researchers. And that could, well, suggested that that's demonstrating the fact that the people who are providing the funding don't have the same interests as the people who are applying for funding. And where those interests aren't aligned, you don't get the money and the research doesn't get done. It doesn't mean that research isn't important. It just means that it's not important to the people who are providing the funding. And then in our own research, I'm assuming that we're not all reviewing too many grants or too many high-level grants potentially, but we are ourselves gatekeepers of replication efforts that can follow our research. So thinking about who has access to the materials or results that you produce with your research. Now, we're assuming that we're all fans of open science here, and that's fantastic. But what can you do to improve the access that you give to your to people when you put your work out there? So the most basic demonstration is around software again. So if your analysis relies on a licensed paid for software, then the only people who can replicate it are people who can afford to buy that software. The same with your results, or maybe not in terms of software, but for example, if your results rely on someone understanding how to use a particular language, coding language, then those people who don't yet know how to use that language, they can't access your replication. Now, I'm not suggesting that you rewrite all your software in every language that's available, but it's just something to be mindful of. How can you impose limits on who can access your materials and who can reproduce your work? Equally, who can validate your research and who can apply your methods to their own work? Because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to avoid waste. We're trying to expedite positive experiences for the world by reducing the amount of waste in our research. So what can you do to make your own research more reproducible or easier to reproduce and extend by other people who don't necessarily have the same access or experience as you? So we've been talking about inclusivity, but it's also important, I think, to recognize the impact of being excluded as well. So just to yourself, I would love for you to think about when you felt particularly welcome or included, or unwelcome or excluded in a group. Now, this can be a social experience, or it can be like a scientific work experience. And how did that feeling of being included or excluded affect your motivation? If you turn up at a party and everyone is really kind and welcoming to you, how does that affect your experience? Or if you turn up to a party and people aren't acknowledging your presence, or perhaps everyone is drinking a lot of alcohol and you don't drink, how does that affect your experience? Now, as you can imagine, it's not a positive experience being excluded. So poor inclusivity, when we're talking about our projects, our systems of science, poor inclusivity is exclusion. So research has shown that exclusion lowers commitment and engagement, and it also increases health problems. So if you are in a working environment where groups or individuals are being excluded, that is contributing negatively to their own physical health and mental health as well. Exclusion can also increase job and educational performance anxiety. Now, as researchers and as PhD students or undergraduate students, we're mostly pretty anxious about our own performance anyway. So creating an environment that promotes exclusion is not going to be a positive experience for anyone who's already experiencing some kind of performance anxiety. And it also, exclusion increases stereotype threat behaviors. So stereotype threat is, for example, it's commonly believed that women can't do maths. So if women are in an exclusive environment, an environment where they're excluded, that kind of threat of that stereotype exacerbates their own performance. Performance is diminished because they feel like they're being excluded. They think people are going to think they're bad at maths, so they perform poorly. It also reduces career aspirations and receptivity to feedback. So in general, being excluded or being in an environment in which you are excluded or certain individuals are excluded is not great for their performance, which I would say is not great for your science and your project, but it's also not great for the system of science. So moving on to what we can do to try and include people in our research and remove these exclusion practices. So on this table, which I've borrowed from Malvika Sharan, who I'll mention in the thank yous, this table goes through some open science practices that we all know and love, and it identifies what the purpose of the activity is, like what the main agenda is around undertaking this practice, what the default position looks like, and how we can introduce inclusion into that equation and make a more inclusive open research practice. So first, starting with preprints and open review and open access. So the general aim of preprints and open review is to aid research and development. And so, for example, a preprint might be put out to speed up the time it takes to get something from research to publication. So getting something published can take months, years in some cases, but if your preprint can be put out there, people can review it publicly and openly. But in creating a preprint, inclusivity doesn't have to be the priority. But what we can be aware of, and this is pretty straightforward with preprints, is that we are giving access for free to people. So communities who don't have the monetary resources to access paper or journals, we've reduced that barrier of entry and access for them. So by having a preprint and open access, we have included other people who can't afford to pay for the incredibly high journal subscription costs. When we're sharing our data or code, the intention around that activity is to make our materials available for scrutiny. It's about transparency. So here I'm sharing my data and my code, and you can all review it, and you can all be very confident that my research is fantastically valid and I've not made any mistakes anywhere. And in doing so, I, as a user, a researcher who I've shared my data and code, I don't really have to spend too much time considering the resources or knowledge of the person who's going to be reviewing my material. If I've put my data out there, then I'm being incredibly transparent. But if we want to include other people in our research, we have to, or we can be mindful of the fact that everything that we put out there should be designed to be read and understood and evaluated by anyone to a certain extent. So this is things like commenting in your code or having a data dictionary alongside your data. So not only are you putting out variables which mean nothing to anyone, but you can do some additional work to make sure that your code is readable and your variables can be easily understood, so many other people can access it, rather than just you and your colleague down the road who wrote the paper with you. Looking at open source and community science, one of the main agendas around that activity is to promote collaborative work culture, which is absolutely fantastic. I love open source communities. I love community science. But you don't necessarily have to include the talents of diverse backgrounds when you're building your community. So you can have an open source community who's built of a bunch of people who are very similar in terms of their backgrounds and experience. And that can be a fine functioning open source community, but really that's going to be missing the robust factor as well. So for example, if you are writing documentation and it's all written and read by exactly the same people, then that's fantastic. But what you're doing there is you're excluding other people who haven't got that same experience and background. And there are many voices that will be missing from that conversation about how that work can be extended or promoted or delivered, because they don't have the same background and experience as the people who developed the work. So again, including the more diverse community in your open source project will create a more robust product at the end of the project. And finally, looking at open educational materials or analysis notebooks, for example. So the main aim of these resources is around training and learning, and that's wonderful. But again, it's not something that is considered to be
a requirement of a research publication. It's often just like an extra thing, like I've created a notebook about it, like a Jupyter notebook, that demonstrates a process or some part of my research. And that's an additional nice thing that I can share with my research, but it's not something that is mandatory. Now, I'm not suggesting it absolutely has to be mandatory, but if we were to put more effort into sharing educational resources around our research as well, then we will be empowering the individuals who are picking up our research to upskill themselves. We're transferring the skills from our own knowledge base to those of our readers. And that can be a fantastic opportunity for people to develop their own skills and experience. Excuse me. So we're nearly at the end here. We know how our open science practices can be transformed, or we can design inclusivity into our research practices, but there's also certain behaviors that we can adopt in our own teams to build inclusive environments. So for example, there we go. For example, one of my kind of big bugbears at the moment is the use of gender neutral addresses. So it's really, really common for people to say, hey guys. And that's for me and my 3-year-old daughter now, who picks up on it. Guys is not a gender neutral address. So if you've got a room of researchers and you say, hi guys, you're addressing the men in that room and thereby excluding anyone who doesn't identify as a man. So a simple switch, what sounds simple, is to say folks instead of guys, or colleagues, or esteemed friends, however you like to say it. And it sounds like an easy switch, but it's such a difficult habit to crack. So I work really hard, and still I get this wrong many, many times. And I challenge you to be aware of the next time you say, hi guys, or a friend or colleague says, hi guys. And just remember, when someone is saying, hi guys, they're saying, hello men in the room, and how that feels for the women in the room. You can also start to do things like specify your own pronouns. So I've got my pronouns on my Zoom profile, on my email, on my Twitter at the start of this talk. Anywhere I can have them, I put my pronouns. So the intention of this is to encourage people not to assume or guess my gender. And I don't have I haven't encountered a situation where my gender has been assumed incorrectly, but this is not for me. This is for people whose gender isn't so stereotypically socially normalized. So if we normalize the process of identifying our own pronouns, then when someone declares their pronouns and they perhaps aren't quite as obviously aligned with the gender they're assigned at birth, for example, then people will start to recognize that pronouns exist and they don't always match your assumptions. So they'll look for the specified pronouns and stop assuming gender, which for someone who's trans or non-binary can be a really problematic, really demoralizing, and really exclusionary practice to be your gender to be assumed and to be misgendered. I would think we can all do some work as well to promote inclusive event design. So as we're all moving to online, this is wonderful in many, many ways. Online events are fantastic, but we also need to be aware of what barriers we're imposing with our events. So for example, time zones. If everything in the event is planned for a certain time zone, then people in other time zones will not be able to access material so readily. It's not an easy situation to fix, but it's something that you should be aware of and try and address where you can. Also be aware of the fact that as a lot of people are at home, a lot of people have caring responsibility, and often those people are women. So women are disproportionately affected by caring responsibilities. So if you have an event that runs all day over the weekend, then it's not going to be easy for someone who has a part-time or especially not full-time caring responsibility. So doing things like recording talks and making them available afterwards is a really nice way of accounting for that fact of people's availability to attend. And also around disability. So for example, I'm using subtitles at the moment, and I do that for people who have auditory, additional auditory needs, and also for people who don't speak English as a first language. I'm aware I speak quite quickly, and even though the AI that's on these subtitles might not be perfect, it might make for a better experience to someone who has a hearing disability. It might make it easier for them to follow along and get involved with the talk and the materials. So encouraging people to use subtitles, encouraging people to use dyslexia-friendly fonts and colours can be a really positive effect for people who have access needs. This is a long list, but you know, so we've got a long way to go. So another really great way you can promote inclusivity in your own team is to create opportunities for diverse role models. So caveat to this one, beware of overburdening an already under-resourced group. So say, for example, you're doing an event for, I'm trying to think of like physics, for example, and you've got this situation. You may have heard of a thing called a manel, which is a panel which is made up of all men, or equally you can have an all-white panel. And then in the public eye, there's this one person who ticks the diversity box, and they're the one person that is always invited to give these talks and give these presentations and be this almost tokenistic representation of diversity for this group. Now, it's great to include diverse voices, but be careful of always including the same person and making them responsible for always delivering the message about diversity. It's everyone, I love doing talks. I don't know, everyone loves doing talks. I love doing talks, but to do the same work of representing this diversity, like tick box exercise over and over again, will mean that it's detracting from their research. And most people that we're inviting to these events, they're active researchers. So this is the issue about overburdening a group that's already stretched and under-resourced because of their diversity. You can also do some work within your own events or projects that you're collaborating on to identify. So rather than just waiting for diversity to show up, you have to go out and actually identify diverse contributors, and not just the same collaborators you always hear about or you always use. So this is the idea that diversity doesn't just happen, it's something that you have to actually work on. So go out, follow people on Twitter that you haven't followed before, ask people that you haven't spoke to before, and see what you can do to actively bring in diverse contributors to your work. I would love for anyone who's not aware of the idea of privilege to educate yourself on the impact of privilege. So this is the idea that just through virtue of who I happen to be born as, I am benefiting from that in some ways more than someone who is different from me. So I'm white, therefore the world, the Western world is designed to support my experience, whereas someone who is born Black, their lived experience won't be as privileged as mine, just through the virtue of who they were born as. So this is, it can be a difficult one to be comfortable with in the outset. So if I say to my parents, for example, well, you have that experience because you're white, it can be a really kind of cognitively difficult thing to accept that they are treated and carried in the world in a certain way without feeling like, oh, well, it's not just because I'm white, it's because I do this behavior, you know, it's because I don't do this other behavior. But the performance of that behavior depends on the privilege that was afforded to you in the first place. So it's a tricky one. I just ask you, if you're not familiar with this, just to sit with it and think about it for a while, and maybe do some reading around privilege online. There's some really like simple videos and demonstrations of how privilege impacts life and behavior and performance across the board. And then finally, I would invite us all to be cognizant of the voices which are not in the room. So I can't see the room right now, but in many, many situations, you'll look around the room and find that diversity is missing. And then there's not only the diversity that you can see, the sort of biodemographic diversity, there's also hidden diversity as well, for example, around religion. So try and be mindful, or just take a check every now and then of, what does this room look like? What are they made? What kind of people are they made up of? And who is missing? Who are we not listening to in these discussions? And there's not an easy answer for this, but it's just, again, something to be aware of, and then think about what impact that might have moving forward. So now we're going to put this all together in a pie chart. Pie. So what we started talking about open science as about sharing. Open science is about sharing resources. If we can't share resources, people can't reproduce our work. Sharing requires access. So in order to reproduce our work, people have to be able to access it. And that access or resource availability can be based on historic exclusion and privilege. So in order to do good open science, we need to be thinking about ways, or we need to be mindful of the fact that access to the products that we're sharing comes with privilege and exclusion factors. We talked briefly about some terminology and the fact that diversity isn't the same as inclusivity. So diversity is being invited to the party, but inclusivity is everyone's song being played and everyone else valuing it as well. We talked about equality and that not being the same as justice. So justice is addressing the cause of equality, and this, I think, is something we should be looking to move towards: justice-oriented science, not just open or inclusive science, but science that is oriented towards removing barriers for everyone. We introduced this idea that inclusivity leads to robust research. So we know that in diverse teams, more robust products are built within a team that is more diverse. And this applies not only to individual projects, but also, I think, in our system of science. So our scientific literature base as a whole is likely to be more robust if we have more diverse input into it. We talked a bit about subgroups and inclusive teams versus teams that look to be diverse, but they're actually too small subgroups, for example, and how subgroups can lead to stereotypes between them. So stereotypes have some really negative effects in terms of stereotype threats and, for example, error management culture. But these negative effects of stereotypes can be mitigated if our teams are truly mixed up, not just on the surface. So don't just look at the surface. We've got 5 men and 5 women. Think about how those characteristics interact with each other to form subgroups. And then we looked briefly at the pro-diversity beliefs of our leaders. So whether we've got inclusive teams or subgroups, the beliefs and actions and behaviors of our leaders can overcome the kind of negative effects that we see around diversity beliefs. But then I'd like you to think about as well, how diverse are our leaders? So they may have wonderful pro-diversity beliefs, and many people do, but they themselves might not be that diverse as a group. And what impact is that having on our research? And finally, we talked about ways that we could improve our own practice. So I invited you to think about whether your work and your practice is creating exclusion. Think about who can reproduce your work and what barriers you have in place, and whether the projects that you are part of are inclusive by design, and what additional measures you can put in place to improve the inclusivity in your projects. So here we were thinking about why inclusivity is relevant to open science. And in terms of the grander pie, we only really touched on this in 2 small areas. So I think it's an argument that we can, or a discussion that I would love to continue with people, but I think it's actually quite a straightforward argument. When I say to people, your research isn't reproducible, if it's only reproducible by people who are the same as you, then it's kind of often a moment like, oh yes, I understand now. It's not just good enough to make my results available, I also have to work to make sure that everyone, or as many people as possible, can access them. So this is the idea of open science being about sharing and access, and the benefit that comes to all of us is about inclusivity, bringing robust research projects. And then for the majority of the talk, we're talking about how we can do inclusivity, how we need to be mindful of the differences around justice and diversity, for example, how we need to be mindful about how our teams are made up, what our leaders believe, and what we can do in our own work. So it's a big, messy, complicated picture. But what I wanted to do for you today is to introduce a few concepts, start to encourage you to think about ways inclusivity affects your work, and also give you a few pointers about little behaviors that you can change in your own day-to-day lives if you'd like to improve the inclusivity of the experience of people around you, people who traditionally might have been excluded, and have a fantastic opportunity to bring benefit to your work and to science, but because of inclusivity or exclusion, they haven't been able to in the past. So going back to our original narrative of someone who's pro-open scholarship and pro-inclusivity, but they're not sure whether one necessarily implies the other, I go back to this idea that your work is not reproducible if it's only accessible to people who are exactly like you. And also be mindful of the fact that you don't work in a vacuum. You approach your research as a person with experience, and that makes your practice positional. It comes from the position of you. So remember that the work you produce is from your position, and can someone who is in a different position, how can they approach it and access your research as well? Or what is stopping them from adopting your position? Tons of references, like you're not going to read this, but the slides will be available. I really enjoy giving this talk, and the literature is very, very dense, but I think not quite yet distilled down into direct application to our own research. So when we talk about the occupational psychology of literature, for example, it's deep. But this is something that I'm personally trying to get involved in more, in terms of how can we demonstrate that science is better if it is diverse. And there is a growing amount of interest in doing that kind of research. So soon the literature will be full of, let's say, examples that are relevant to our own research as well. So finally, some thank yous to Malvika Sharan on the far right, whose work I directly referenced, and Kirsty Whitaker, who along with Malvika now has been doing a lot of work around inclusivity and talking very openly about inclusivity in a way that's really empowering, and just leading by example in ways that is really positive. And then final thanks to Stefan Hunis as well, who was my co-chair of the OHBM Open Science Room this year, and was a great foil for me to express these ideas around inclusivity, and also with the rest of the Open Science SIG. And yeah, it really encouraged me to pursue this agenda in a very supportive and thoughtful way. So thank you to Stefan for allowing me to delve into this work. And then a couple of groups that I've belonged to or been a part of that have been really important in my journey around inclusivity is the Open Life Sciences program run by Malvika and two colleagues, which is around the Mozilla Open Leadership Principles, and also the Centre for Scientific Collaboration and Community Engagement. This is a project which seeks to professionalise the roles of community managers and community coordinators, which I'm one of. And we have our own diversity and equality special interest group, where they're really helping us have these conversations in safe spaces in ways that can be beneficial to everyone involved. So thank you all again for listening. I hope you've taken away something, and I really look forward to having the discussions after this session. Thank you.